We're quickly approaching draft season, so today I'm talking about the top 10 tips to dominate your draft, coming right up. And welcome to episode number 1 of the Gridiron Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Chip Moran. I am your host today. I appreciate you listening and joining me. If you can't listen to us on the podcast, you can always watch us on YouTube at Gridiron Fantasy Football. Now, I've been wanting to do a podcast for years, but I really never felt like the time was right to do it. I always felt like there was something hindering me and always just kind of roadblocking me to be able to do a podcast. And, well, I have the most time to do it now because things have been kind of crazy, just like everyone else, and I felt like this is the best time to be able to do a podcast and finally do something I'm passionate about. You know, I'm super stoked to finally take that leap. You know, I love sports. I've been around sports my whole life. I was an ex-baseball player, ex-football player. You know, I practice physical therapy and I'm a certified personal trainer. So I've been around sports. You know, I've worked with NFL athletes. So my whole career and my upbringing has always been around sports, and I just am really excited to be able to do this podcast. You know, I do feel like I can bring a different dynamic to the table, a different perspective on injury and performance that most experts have to kind of go and outsource from, you know. So I wanted to do something where you can be a one-stop shop for all your fantasy football knowledge and just win you a championship, because that's the main goal. The main goal is to make sure that we are providing you the best information, the most accurate information to make sure that you are going to win your fantasy league. Now, today, it's the very first episode, and I wanted to do something that is pretty much something that you can take in towards your draft. So today we're talking about the top 10 tips to prepare for your draft. You know, we are entering draft season, and there's over 40 million people that play fantasy football alone, and that number continues to grow. So if you are a veteran or a beginner, I hope you really get value out of this episode, and it's something that you can take and actually apply to your draft, because I really think these 10 tips really help you when it comes to preparing for the draft, because it starts in the offseason. It starts on figuring out the best teams and the best leagues to join. So right now we're going to jump right into the top 10 tips to dominate your fantasy draft. So tip number 1 for me is you want to try to find and create a league that's competitive with you, your friends, your coworkers, because you want to find a league that's really enjoyable for you, something that you want to be a part of, that you're not having half the league that's just not paying attention. You got people who don't set their rosters. You got people who auto draft. Like, you really want to find that league that is competitive, it's fun, and there's going to be trash talking, all that, because that's all part of fantasy football. It's also doing a league with your friends, but as well as just be able to take money from them, be able to do things and just have like that trash talk ammunition for you to have during the season, all that. So I think really tip number 1 is to find that league that you really will enjoy, that you can be a part of, and it can be a league that stays around for a very long time, because the best leagues are the ones who are around for years and years and years. Now, if you are a beginner and you just want to play in public leagues, just get your feet wet, that's a great option as well. But I think that you'll find when it means something, that's where you're going to have a lot more fun, because I think that's where you're going to have, you know, you're going to pay attention to everything that happens. You're going to be very active during the off season and during this in-season processes and all that stuff. So tip number 1 by far is to find that league that, you know, is best suited for you. Tip number 2, what is your league setup? I mean, how many teams do you have? Is it a 10-team league? Is it a 12-team? Is it a 16-team league? You know, is it redraft? Is it keeper? Is it dynasty? Is your draft a snake draft? Is it an auction draft? What's your scoring system? Is it half PPR? Is it PPR? Is it standard? What's your roster structure? Do you have a 1-quarterback league, a 2-quarterback league? Are you playing a super flex? Do you guys play defenses? Do you guys play kickers? You know, all this matters. You know, is it, you know, for example, I mean, when it comes to drafting, you have to know these things, because there are going to be players that you draft in a PPR that you won't necessarily have highly in your standard league drafts. So people like Jameson Crowder, Hunter Renfrow, you know, James White, Tariq Cohen and all those people are good for PPR leagues, but not so much for standard. So I think when you look at your draft and you look at your roster structure, you look at your scoring system structure, those things matter. So really pay attention to all those things. For example, my main league is a 10-team league. Now we play 2 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, a tight end, a flex, a defense, and no kicker. Okay, so and we're an auction league, so that's kind of something that I've really enjoyed because I know exactly what my budget's going to be because we play with a $200 budget. I know, okay, our league pretty much sets our own values on players, so we have all these things where going to the draft, you have a budget and you kind of know exactly what players you can probably go all out for, some players that you can probably get on the cheap, but all that stuff matters. So really pay attention to the league structure, the roster set up and all that, because that plays a role when you start planning for your draft. Now, tip number 3, it probably goes without saying, but really try not to be a homer. Really try to avoid choosing players on your favorite team. Now, honestly, if you're going to have a team that has a bunch of studs, it's obvious that if they're fantasy relevant, you're going to choose those players. For me, I'm a Tampa Bay Bucks fan, so this year, for instance, I would love to have Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, all those players on my roster. But obviously, that's not feasible. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to have enough money to be able to do that. If I was in a snake draft, there's no way I'll be able to get all those players. So you want to try to find a way to, maybe if you're a Panthers fan, obviously if you have Christian McCaffrey, you want to draft him if that's your favorite player on your favorite team. That obviously will matter. But like when it comes to trying to pick everybody on your favorite home team, please avoid that because it's going to hurt you in the long run. There are going to be a couple of times where you're going to find offenses that you can sustain that. For instance, like Kansas City, you can probably have Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill. You're going to have Travis Kelce. But in those instances, I would rather have a quarterback, receiver, tight end combo rather than trying to have from every position. So just pay attention to that. Really try to avoid getting all these players from your favorite team. And then tip number 4 is you really want to try to separate real football from fantasy football, which means is that there are going to be players out there that are not fantasy relevant, but they still have this big name. So a person like Frank Gore or Adrian Peterson, these are 2 guys that are Hall of Fame players. And unfortunately, they just are not the same premier running backs that they were when they were in their prime. It's one of those things where you just have to pay attention to your draft and know like these guys were great, but it's not somebody that I want to draft on my roster only because of their name. Now, for instance, like last year, like Le'Veon Bell was a huge name on people's rosters that just didn't do anything because of, it could have been the year off that he had from football. It could have been obviously the offensive scheme that's in there with the Jets, but he just didn't have the fantasy value that you would expect from Le'Veon Bell like he was in Pittsburgh. So, like I said, pay attention. Just make sure that you can separate real football from fantasy football, and you should do fine. Now, tip number 5 is, I feel like the offseason is the most crucial part of fantasy football. I think that when you look at the coaching changes, you look at free agency, you look at the injury status of players, the NFL draft, I mean, these things matter when it comes to how players' fantasy value can change. For me, when Bruce Arians came the coach for the Bucks, well, we knew that he was bringing a high-powered offensive with him, and it showed last year. I mean, even though Jameis Winston threw 30 interceptions, I mean, he was fantasy relevant all season because he was just chucking the ball, didn't care, just whatever. And you saw that. You saw Chris Godwin become a fantasy star. You saw Mike Evans have a decent year fantasy-wise. I mean, that's where you want to see things happen in fantasy, where coaches that are offensive-minded go to a high-power offense, which brings out more fantasy studs. Now, for example, I just mentioned him in the last tip, Le'Veon Bell. Le'Veon Bell goes from a high-powered offense in Pittsburgh, and then he goes to an offense in New York with Adam Gase that doesn't utilize him like he should be utilized. He is a guy who's a workhorse back. He's a great receiver out of the backfield, and he wasn't given the opportunity for whatever reason. I mean, it was very frustrating to be a Le'Veon Bell owner last year and him not be able to produce like he usually does produce based on the offense. And I think you have to pay attention to that. You have to pay attention to, was my team that got the coach or fired the coach, are they bringing in a defensive coach? Because is their style going to be more ground and pound? I mean, all that stuff matters. So really pay attention to the offseason. And obviously, like free agency, a good, another example exactly was what I just said was with Le'Veon Bell. It just shot him in the foot when it came to his value as a fantasy owner. And now I don't think it's Le'Veon Bell, it's the coach. And I think that's what matters. And this year, you have Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon goes to Denver, and Philip Lindsay's already there. So it's going to be very interesting to kind of see how that dynamic plays out, because Philip Lindsay's no slouch. He's a good running back. And Melvin Gordon is, I mean, he's a superior running back. He's a better pass catcher and everything like that. So do you draft Melvin Gordon early because the fact that he's Melvin Gordon just because of the name? So just really pay attention to that. Make sure that you know exactly how things will play out. And if we have a off season with the training camp and preseason games, you'll probably see kind of how he's going to be utilized, in the preseason. But just pay attention to where these players went. And lastly, the injury status. There's going to be players that are come off an injury that you probably want to draft that you may be able to sneak on your roster, but it may be a wasted roster spot. A good example is right now what's going on in Seattle. I mean, you have Chris Carson coming back from a hip injury. You have Rashad Penny coming back from an ACL injury. And then they just signed Carlos Hyde. And I think that tells you something based on the status of these two guys coming back from injury. There's been some talk that Rashad Penny is actually dealing with some more structural damage in his knee. So if it wasn't purely just an ACL injury and he's dealing with some other stuff structurally, that's going to delay him going forward. He's obviously going to be put on the PUP list, and he's probably not going to be ready until, obviously I think the earliest is week 6, so you may not see him any fantasy relevant until week 8, week 10, based on how his knee holds up and how his rehab goes. So pay attention to these things. It does matter. So let's go on to the next one. So tip number 6, during the offseason, as like right now, you need to mock draft. Mock draft is going to help you tremendously when it comes to knowing where players' ADP is, where their average draft position is. You really need to do mock drafts, kind of get a better insight on players that, maybe going way too early or going early, or players that you can probably sit back on based on, everybody's rankings, because the draft is the most unpredictable thing. You have, just like I said, tip number 1, it depends on your draft, your draft in the league mates you have, because you want to make sure that there's some consistency on how people are drafting, but you just never know how that's going to play out. So you really want to mock draft, get a better idea on players that you may be targeting that possibly could be going a lot earlier than you expect, and people that you may have to be aggressive getting. And then also on the flip side, trying to figure out what players you can probably sit back on and just be patient for. So really, really do what you can, mock draft. There's a lot of free apps out there where you can do some mock drafts. So I highly recommend mock drafting as much as you can. So tip number 7, when you go into your draft, have a plan, but learn how to pivot, know when you have to pivot, and just adjust as the draft takes place. My plan usually is I go running back heavy. I like drafting 3 running backs with my first 3 picks. Now I'm in a PPR league, and I try to find those running backs that are heavily involved in the passing game. Now for me, I do know though, if those running backs are not available, then I'm going to have to pivot to go for a receiver that has better value. But don't get stuck so much on one particular plan, because you have no idea how the draft's going to play out. So for me, a good example was last year. I love Alvin Kamara. I've had him every single year he's been in the league. But last year, everybody knew it. And I'm in an auction league, so Alvin Kamara was the last tier of the top tier running backs available. And I knew I wanted him. Everyone else knew I wanted him. And I had to pay a crap load of money for him. I had to pay $73 to get my favorite running back. And obviously it didn't pan out during the season because he got injured and all that. However, that was an instance where I should have pivoted. I should have went for guys with better value where I could have probably added more depth. But, you're going to have those favorite players that you really want to have, and Alvin Kamara is one of them, so I paid up for him. Now, because of that, I had to chill out on my draft. I had to wait and let the draft come to me. And the one guy that I was able to get was Josh Jacobs. I was able to get him for only $6, and it was because people in my league had Devin Singletary and David Montgomery ranked higher. I actually had Josh Jacobs ranked higher, so when I got him for $6, I was ecstatic about it because I was able to fill out my RB2 slot with not a big budget. So that's where, if you do get aggressive with players, you just have to kind of feel it out and just let players come to you. Hopefully you get a good value later on in the draft. But that's particularly, my strategy. But most people have their own strategies. So if you like going receiver heavy, go for it. But just know when to pivot. Now, tip number 8, you really want to pay attention to runs and don't reach on players in the draft. There's going to be an instance where all of a sudden a particular position like quarterback or tight end start getting drafted, early, and there's a run on them. Really try to avoid getting on that train because you're going to be able to find the quarterback in the tight end position later on in the draft. Now, if you're in a 2-quarterback league, that's totally different than in a 1-quarterback league. But most people play in a 1-quarterback league. So just try to wait on those players. For a good example, Lamar Jackson last year was ADP of 16. Well, he was obviously the number 1 quarterback, and people got him later on in the draft. The people that drafted Patrick Mahomes in the 2nd or 3rd round probably didn't have enough nucleus around to kind of help build their roster because they took quarterback so early. So I think that when it comes to quarterback, you can chill and wait till later on in the draft and pick a guy where you're going to be able to plug and play and be decent for you for fantasy. Another position as well is tight end. You have your Kelsey, you have Kittle, you have your Zach Ertzes of the league, and those guys are going to be drafted early. You just know that's going to happen. And sometimes when you see a tight end drafted, you start seeing those runs, and then all the tight ends get drafted, and then you feel like you have to get a tight end. Don't worry about that. Really look at what happened last year. Mark Andrews was a guy that was a sleeper who no one really drafted in their drafts. I mean, I picked up Mark Andrews on free agency, and Mark Andrews was the number 2 tight end last year. Same for Darren Waller. Darren Waller he was known because of Hard Knocks, and people liked his story, and then there was potential of him being able to break out, but it wasn't really sure of how that was going to play out. And then Antonio Brown gets released by the Raiders, and all of a sudden Darren Waller becomes the number 1 target. Now, that's an awesome opportunity because after all my drafts have happened, I was able to pick up Darren Waller in my main league and replace Vance McDonald with him. And obviously that was a good pivot, but I think that these are players that you can get. There's going to be tight ends that break out. And the last example is Austin Hooper. Austin Hooper finished last year tight end 7. So these guys are not being drafted early in any of these drafts. So from last year. So when you look at tight end this year, there's going to be guys that you can chill on, wait, and let the draft come to you, and don't feel like you have to reach for those particular players. So, that's, for me, is what I would do with tip number 8. Tip number 9, you want to know your rookies and where they landed during the draft. Where they are on the depth chart, this can be a huge benefit to your draft strategy because there is a lot of things that happen during the preseason, and there's a lot of players that get drafted that you probably don't even care about because they're a rookie, they got drafted behind another starter. But you have to pay attention to this because, for example, in 2017, I went after David Johnson after he had his breakout season. And I was trying to find a way to, build depth in my roster, and I really didn't have the budget to get guys that are with higher ranking. So for me, with my last pick of the draft, I was able to draft Kareem Hunt. And the reason why I did that is because any running back that goes to Andy Reid's offense is going to produce. But also, I was never a big fan of Spencer Ware. So I decided, okay, I'm going to take a flyer on Kareem Hunt and see if he can beat out Spencer Ware for the starting position. And he was drafted in the 3rd round, which I feel like when a team drafts a player with higher draft picks, you know that they're going to be part of the offense some way, somehow. So it worked out for me where I was able to pick up Kareem Hunt. Now, Spencer Ware, unfortunately, tore his PCL, so then he was out for the season, so it gave me a starting running back. And on top of that, I actually picked up Alvin Kamara as well. I know Alvin Kamara's situation is a little bit different, but back when Mark Ingram was there and Adrian Peterson was there, but he has so much buzz going around him that he fit that offense very well with New Orleans. So I went ahead and stashed him on my roster and waited, and finally Adrian Peterson was released, which gave Alvin Kamara his opportunity to shine. And when I lost David Johnson that year because of a wrist injury, Kareem Hunt and Alvin Kamara were my starting running backs. So it really pays dividends if you pay attention to these rookies that go to these teams that can produce. Now with wide receiver, that's a little different. Usually rookie wide receivers don't do much in the first half of the year, if all the whole year. And you see some receivers kind of start getting their traction later on in the season. Now last year, Terry McLaurin came right out of the gate, doing well in fantasy. DK Metcalf, it took some time for him to get used to the game. And then A.J. Brown, we all know what he did later on in the season. So when it comes to rookie receivers, especially this year, CeeDee Lamb goes to the Dallas Cowboys. I can't imagine him being a fantasy relevant player, at least for this year. With Judy out in Denver, I really don't know how he's going to play out. He may have a better chance to do something fantasy-wise because Cortland Sutton's the number 1 and Judy's going to be the number 2. So I think Judy has potential as a rookie receiver, and also Rager, the guy that got drafted from the Eagles, I think he has the potential to actually do something as well. So just pay attention on how these guys are being used during the offseason, during training camp, during the preseason, because these may be guys that you can take a late flyer on in draft, and they could be league winners. You just never know. But pay attention. And last but not least, this shouldn't be really a tip. This should be common knowledge, but I'm putting it in there because it happens every single year. Please do not draft a kicker or a defense before the last 2 picks. It happens every single year. There's going to be somebody who drafts the New England Patriots defense somewhere in the 7th round or whatever because they're the number 1 defense. Please don't be that guy or girl. Please just pay attention and don't draft the defense or a kicker, because it's going to be 2 positions you're going to stream all year long, right? Now, yes, there could be a team out there that does well. It's probably not going to be the Patriots again this year, but don't use high draft stock on a defense. You're going to drop them anyways because you're going to, during a bye week, unless you're getting ready for the playoffs later on in the season, you're not going to roster more than 1 defense throughout the season. So just please don't do that. And when it comes to kickers, try to find a kicker that's going to be on a high-powered offense, because obviously that's going to benefit you if you're in a league that has kickers. And most leagues, honestly, it's not required to draft a defense or a kicker during your draft, but if you have to, use them for your last 2 picks. So those are my 10 tips. Let's go and review. Tip number 1, just like I said, you want to find and create a league that's competitive with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Tip number 2, you want, what's your league setup like? All that matters when it comes to your draft strategy. Tip number 3, don't be a homer. Avoid only choosing players on your favorite team. Tip number 4, try to separate real football from fantasy football. Tip number 5, in the offseason, please pay attention to all the coaching changes, free agency, injury updates, and the NFL draft. Tip number 6, during the offseason, please mock draft a lot. I cannot stress this enough. It's really going to help you in your draft. Tip number 7, have a plan, but learn how to adjust during your draft. Learn when to pivot. Tip number 8, pay attention to runs and don't reach on players. Tip number 9, know your rookies and where they landed during the draft. Tip number 10, please do not draft a defense or kicker before your last 2 picks. Well, that's it. Those are my top 10 tips. Now, I will say that you're not going to win your league in the draft. That's where you build a good nucleus, and that's where you can build your team around. You don't want to think the end-all be-all is in the draft. You're not going to make free agency moves. You're not going to make trades. Just know that when you actually get done with your draft, that's when the real season begins, because it all matters if trades happen, injuries happen, all these things play a role into your season. So make sure that you always stay active during your season. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Let me know if you found value out of this episode and leave a comment. Also, if there's a tip that I may have overlooked, leave a comment as well. Let's discuss it. I want to be a close community. So if there's a comment that rings a bell for me, then I'll bring it up on the next podcast and the next video, because I want that to be something that we are able to do, is engage with one another. And if there's something that is a great idea or a great tip, I want to bring that to everyone's attention. So once again, thank you so much for listening. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at the Gridiron Pod, and on Instagram at Gridiron Fantasy Football. Don't forget to click subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss another episode. Have a great day, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Take care.